Hi, folks. These are highlights on chapter 12 and 13 in our textbook. Um, these are interesting chapters. 12 is treatment settings and models of healthcare. And there's only 3 or 4 things I want to point out. But as always, the reading's good. Tables are good to look at. I'm just pointing out some things that I either differ in my opinion or want to highlight some aspect of the example that they give. On the top of page 111, the top of the left-hand column, it talks about areas of practice, in general, healthcare practice areas, and says they're grouped into 3, the biological or the medical, psychological, and sociological or social. You probably already know there's a lot of overlap, and I would just say that the medical area of practice and sociological, if that includes the school system, are probably the areas with the most OTs working in them. And the psychological, we typically, as OTs, we think of the psych setting as psychiatry. Used to be inpatient, more institutional, and now it's really much more outpatient day centers, clubhouse model, and things like that. Um, Table 12.1 is really good, and it talks about the different aspects of these 3 areas of practice. I want to say that even though they overlap, um, a good example of how they really don't overlap is at the bottom of page 111 on the little square where they're talking about an OT practitioner working in a community mental health setting. Well, that's a typical setting for someone who works in a psych setting. But it says the OT practitioner discovers specific upper extremity weakness in one of their clients that's there really for psychological problems. And it writes as if the OT can just kind of switch gears and become an an OT who works in the medical setting, primarily in a biological or biomechanical frame of reference. The truth is, in hospitals that have a psych unit, you often see the psych OT working in the psych unit and the kind of regular OT who's more familiar with the biomechanical, biological frame of reference. And they might refer to each other if there's a problem in an area that they're not familiar with. In other words, an OT that works in psych typically does not keep up with what they would need to be able to treat someone with a purely medical issue, like weakness or a limitation in range of motion. It would be nice, but that's where OT is so broad. You pick an area and you specialize, and you don't typically go back and forth. Let me backtrack a little bit and say the little rectangle above that on page 111, where it talks about Jim receives OT services to improve his work skills so he can return to work. That's a really good little scenario. I want to point out that it's typically true of someone who works in a work hardening or industrial rehab setting, um, not a typical hospital. There used to be satellite clinics. Some OTs that worked with people with work injury actually worked in the industry where the person was injured. Now it might be part of a hospital based practice. Um, for people that are hurt on the job, their coverage is through workers' comp insurance, and everything that's done from an OT standpoint has to do specifically with getting that person back on the job. It's a great area to work in. It's definitely a specialty for OT as it is for PT as well. Okay, going to the next page, page 112. Um, the right-hand column talks about hospitals. It says the OT practitioner evaluates feeding, dressing, bathing, and grooming, along with range of motion, and then a number of other things. It says the practitioner may provide activities to increase strength and coordination. I want to make sure we know that when OTs work on increasing strength, it's always in the context of an activity that they need to be doing. Usually an ADL activity, sometimes self-care, sometimes more instrumental activities of daily living, like housekeeping, meal preparation, and things like that. So we would never just like give exercises or use weights to increase strength. Okay. Um, the last thing I want to say about chapter 12 is on page 114. Keep in mind there's well, there's not a lot of tables actually in this chapter. So under supervised living on page 114, um, they mention at the bottom of that paragraph, supervised living, that a person is living in an assisted living facility. And it says older persons may live in assisted living facilities and may require OT services for physical, social, or psychological difficulties. OT practitioners may design activities for groups or individuals. Assisted living is not necessarily, it's typically not the skilled nursing facility setting. And so assisted living is not typically going to receive OT unless there's a specific problem that comes up. Those activities that are planned for someone in assisted living are typically by the activities director, which is a lower paying job, even though it fits right in with what OTs would be doing in terms of the use of activity for therapy. And then finally, it says all-inclusive settings include long-term care facilities that provide OT services and address biological, psychological, and sociological function. That's true, but keep in mind that skilled nursing facilities or SNFs, SNF, are not long-term care. They're typically, you're working with people for 4 to 8 weeks. If they are released from a SNF, they'll either go home or they'll go to long-term care to become a resident and live in the facility. Okay, that's good for this one.